Growing up, we get told a lot of stories. We hear about characters that span a diverse range of ideals. But a figure that's always stood out to me is the Trickster. There are numerous mythological examples that explore the balance between order and chaos, many more that depict the spirit of play. But perhaps the most famous mold comes from the poetic Edda, personified in Loki, the god of mischief. Figures like this often stand as a warning, as the prophesized harbinger whose actions will usher in the end of the world. Yet the Trickster offers a broad range of interpretations, and for every version that acts as an agent of chaos, there is another who brings about a disruptive yet necessary change, which is why the modern representation of this pattern is so intriguing. It implies that to be a creator, you have to be a destroyer as well. Some prophecies are more obvious than others, and Ragnarok, the end of everything, is one such example. Fated as inevitable, the subtle signs of its approach weigh heavily on the shoulders of the Aesir, who, under Odin's control, do everything in their power to alter its destiny, and may have succeeded had it not been for one god's lust for conflict. Loki was a primary driving force behind many of the clashes in Asgard. His actions are responsible for the deaths of many gods and giants. He is the creator of the greatest threats in all the 9 realms, and is both the instigator and central antagonist who leads the forces of chaos at the end of time. But there's a portion of the Ragnarok prophecy that fails to rarely, if ever, get mentioned. It's cyclical. In the end, Ragnarok proceeds as written, the majority of gods die, and the world sinks into the sea. Yet, as the saying goes, every ending is a new beginning, and eventually a new, more prosperous land emerges. The gods begin to rebuild, and Balder, the god of light, returns with the god of darkness, a union that symbolizes the harmonious state of the world. This is the essence of the Trickster, a notoriously difficult figure to define who acts at the border of two opposing forces. Loki's not exactly good, but isn't entirely villainous either. He sows discord, but is also the spark for change. And the reality is, without his actions destabilizing the world, Odin's growing tyranny would go unchecked. Because of this, the only way to truly define the Trickster is as an embodiment of contradictions, something the 9th and 10th century Norsemen were well aware of. It's no coincidence, for example, that Loki is both a friend and a foe, an ally in one story and the chief adversary of the next. He is a character who tangles plots, a character who tricks people into conflict, and a character with no allegiance, which makes it surprising then that the Trickster, a figure so ambiguous and fluid, can also be so universally understood. If the Trickster is unpredictable by nature, it's comforting to think that within the chaos lies a deeper pattern, and across cultures, there does seem to be thematic elements that serve this idea. One of these themes is physical entrapment. The most common point of narrative tension is a balance between order and chaos. As such, it's no coincidence that the Trickster, a metaphor for change, plays a central role in this tension, usually through being physically restricted. This reflects society's efforts to impose order and maintain the unpredictable nature of change. Of course, this attempt to confine disruption only serves to amplify the Trickster's influence, which illustrates a paradox. The more society tries to control the unpredictable, the more potent its potential becomes. And this is something we can see played out in every version of Loki's character. In the Marvel movies, Loki starts out confined in prison, breaking out to steal the Tesseract and disrupt order. In Norse mythology, after Loki kills Balder, he's imprisoned to prevent Ragnarok, eventually breaking out to fulfill the prophecy. This physical restriction can be viewed as a rejection of order, but it also implies something else. Another characteristic of the Trickster is being playful. These individuals are mischievous, curious, and deceitful, but the figure's blatant disregard for rules isn't purely destructive. In fact, it's instinctive, a trait often found in children. By far my favorite example of the Trickster is Skull Kid from Majora's Mask. This is probably the saddest Zelda game of all time. But while theories about what the game represents range from Link being dead to exploring the effects of trauma, I'd like to offer a different interpretation. This game is about growing up. The Trickster is a liminal figure, and as such, it exists between two different worlds. One of the clearest examples of this is the transition between childhood and adulthood, which is why the Trickster is often touted as the precursor to the hero. It is a symbol that, more than anything else, crosses boundaries. Which is important, because in Majora's Mask, Skull Kid is trapped in one of these boundaries, as it's implied that children who get lost in the woods become imps, forever frozen in adolescence. This is the motivation behind his mischievous outburst, as without properly growing up, he begins to feel neglected by his friends, culminating in him spreading chaos across Termina. But beyond this, every significant problem in Majora's Mask revolves around children. In the Goron village, the elder son cries out for his missing father, emblematic of a child's vulnerability. The Zoras have lost their ex, a literal symbol of the next generation being in danger. And in Akina Valley, children are transformed into monsters, trapped in a cycle of death and rebirth. Still, the strongest argument for this theory is that Link can only defeat Skull Kid by becoming an adult, by completing his transformation of maturity, and once he does, the chaos that Skull Kid released turns into a rebirth. This is the primary role of the Trickster. Despite being infantile in nature, it is a necessary step we all go through on the path to maturity, which, by the way, is why the core mechanic of the game is transforming through masks. The Trickster is also a shapeshifter. This is because on the path to adulthood, we all take on new forms and identities, experimenting as we try to discover our true selves. But what really blows my mind about all of this is how it aligns with neuroscience research. One of the most studied areas in adolescent development is risk-taking, specifically why teens are so much more likely to break rules than any other group. And in my research, it seems like there's a biological basis for this. In adolescence, there's a gap in brain development, which means there's a mismatch in the speed at which two different regions of the brain develop. The limbic system, associated with reward and emotion, matures quickly, while the prefrontal cortex, associated with critical thinking, matures slowly. Because of this, there is a heightened activation in the limbic system, and more importantly, the amygdala, which is why teens seek out risk and rule breaking and mischief. They're literally wired to experience heightened dopamine from these activities at this stage of life. But that's not all. As teens take risks, they're actually providing opportunities for their brains to mature, specifically by developing the cognitive control system, which the prefrontal cortex is responsible for. Over time, this leads to the developmental gap between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex closing. What's so funny to me about this is how the trickster archetype captures this idea in stories long before we could explain it with science, acting sort of like a narrative guide explaining how one can grow from the chaotic, self-centered nature of the trickster to the more purposeful, socially oriented archetype of the hero. Another interesting commonality between different tricksters of myth is their role as creators of culture. The best example of this is the spider Anansi. Credited as the trickster god of wisdom, Anansi is the one responsible for introducing humanity to stories, which he himself stole by tricking the sky god into handing over control of them. The Akan retelling of this figure is particularly interesting to me because while other tricksters are implied innovators, it outright states that Anansi is responsible for storytelling, a notion that shouldn't really make any sense. Why would deceit, mischief, or chaos be a prerequisite for creativity? Well, this is going to sound weird, but the answer has to do with theft. One of my favorite books on creativity is How to Steal Like an Artist. As the title suggests, the premise is quite simple. Good artists copy, great artists steal. Stealing in this context doesn't literally mean taking other people's work, but what it does mean is crossing boundaries, taking an old concept and remixing it through a new lens. This is what Picasso did when he invented Cubism, or what Freud did when he revolutionized psychology by taking ancient stories and adding a scientific touch. Of course, the chief example of this is the archetype itself. I think this is why the trickster represents both sides of things. Loki is both a god and a giant. Anansi can move between realms, and Skull Kid is trapped between childhood and adulthood. Just as all of these figures act as a bridge between worlds, creativity requires a double motion, stealing from the old to create something new. And this is literally how creativity is measured, using something called a divergent thinking test. It works by giving a participant an object, a set amount of time, and then evaluating their ability to generate as many different uses as possible. In other words, their ability to exist in that in-between state. Finally, one last common thread in trickster myths ties all of this together nicely: their position as outsiders. All of the characters I've mentioned throughout this video operate on the fringes of society, and as a result, they spend a lot of time causing mischief. But this is not just because they're trying to create chaos. Sometimes it's because they're trying to fit in, which aligns with the hypothesis I have about creativity. One reason why creativity may have evolved is as a way of creating a niche. This is especially the case in larger groups where, to function properly, individuals have different roles to fill. And so one strategy could be for individuals at the bottom of one skill set to leave and make their own skill set, inventing a new role that they are better suited for. Which is kind of what entrepreneurship is, isn't it? It's disrupting the established order to create something new. This is exactly what we see in Trickster myths, and is why this character is often referred to as the creator of culture. If selection shapes who we are, from how our brains work to the way we experience things, and stories come from us, does that not suggest that stories are the only method we have of analyzing the psychology of our ancestors? I bring this up because I find it so interesting that across civilizations, cultures, and eras, the trickster is always a hero and a villain, circulating between the two depending on the context. This doesn't seem accidental to me. Instead, it seems like a reflection on something, and that something is change. Change is a neutral force. It can tip a society toward creation or just as easily toward destruction, and when going through it, we don't know which one it'll be. Which is why I think stories about the trickster serve or have served a cultural function. They act like a warning or maybe a guide depicting how complex change can really be. But there's another reason why I bring this up. Change can only occur if one challenges the way things are. As such, the narrative role of the trickster is to challenge things, to shine a light on what one might consider the darker undertones of society. You know who else does that? Comedians. Comedians are the living embodiment of the trickster archetype and display a lot of the traits that I've discussed throughout this video, such as using a biting wit, operating outside of society, or addressing hot topics. This can only be accomplished because comedians are traversing an edge, navigating a fine line between what we subconsciously understand and what we haven't yet fully acknowledged. Humor is the medium for this, and I think it's because laughter is the sound of understanding. If you think about the last time you found something funny, it was probably an unconscious process. It's not like you thought about laughing, you just did. And that's most likely because the joke revealed something taboo you intuitively understood, but couldn't put into words. This is what happens when a comedian delivers a joke that causes a whole room to roar with laughter. It's like a collective aha moment that allows people to let their guard down. In this way, you can see how humor can be used to challenge a topic too controversial to be outright debated, and dare I say, might be what the biological role of humor is, to provoke or challenge the status quo in a way that wouldn't lead to immediate consequences. Kind of like how in medieval times, the jester was the only one who could get away with criticizing the king. This is what I think is just so interesting about all of this. Stories are like artifacts into the psychology of our ancestors, and if across the world, every period in history has a different interpretation of the same figure, it implies something, and what I think that is a reflection into the good and bad that can come from change. And until next time, cheers.